The moon hangs low over Sherwood Forest, casting long shadows through the ancient oaks. A figure moves silently between the trees, clad in green, his bow slung across his back. Suddenly, he steps into the torchlight of a wealthy noble's carriage, eyes gleaming, voice steady as he demands gold for the starving villagers nearby. This is the Robin Hood we know, the legendary outlaw who stole from the rich to give to the poor. But here's the question that has haunted historians for centuries: was he real? Or is he nothing more than a fairy tale, stitched together from fragments of medieval ballads and wishful thinking? The story of Robin Hood feels timeless, a symbol of rebellion, justice, and the fight against tyranny. We've all grown up with versions of him, from dashing Errol Flynn swinging through Hollywood sets to gritty modern retellings. But beneath the legend lies a tangled web of history where fact and fiction blur. Some records suggest he was a real man, a disgraced nobleman or a common outlaw whose deeds were exaggerated over time. Others argue he's purely mythical, a character invented to give hope to the oppressed. So which is it, and why does this mysterious figure still captivate us? 800 years after his first mention in crumbling manuscripts, that's what we're uncovering today. This isn't just a tale of arrows and stolen treasure. It's a journey into the heart of medieval England, where rebellion simmered beneath the surface of feudal life. We'll sift through ancient court records, decode long-lost ballads, and even visit the ruins of places where Robin might have walked. Along the way, you'll meet the scholars who have dedicated their lives to separating myth from history, and you'll decide for yourself, hero, thief, or something in between. So grab your cloak and join me, because the real story of Robin Hood is stranger, darker, and far more fascinating than any Hollywood script. Hollywood gives us a dashing hero in emerald green tights, romancing Maid Marian while outwitting the bumbling Sheriff of Nottingham with a wink and a perfectly aimed arrow. But the oldest surviving stories paint a very different picture, one written in the ink of medieval ballads, where Robin wears rough wool, not silk, and his world is less about swashbuckling charm and more about survival in a brutal feudal system. These early ballads, scrawled on parchment between the 1300s and 1500s, are our closest link to whatever truth lies beneath the legend, but even they can't agree on who Robin really was. Was he a yeoman farmer wronged by corrupt lords, a violent bandit hiding in the wilderness, or just a catchy name slapped onto every outlaw tale that made villagers cheer? Take the earliest known ballad, Robin Hood and the Monk, where our hero isn't stealing gold for the poor, he's rescuing himself from execution after a drunken prayer session goes horribly wrong. No merry men singing around campfires here, just a desperate man fighting to stay alive. Even the famous "steal from the rich, give to the poor" motto doesn't appear until much later, tacked on as the legend grew rosier with each retelling. Historians peel back these layers like archaeologists brushing dirt from a buried artifact, and what they find is fascinating. Not one man, but a patchwork of rebellious figures whose stories merged over time. Some scholars even argue Robin Hood was less a person and more a brand, a symbol of resistance anyone could adopt, like a medieval superhero mask, yet tantalizing clues keep the debate alive. Court records from York mention a fugitive named Robin Hood as early as 1225, while other documents describe outlaws in Barnsdale Forest, Sherwood's lesser-known cousin robbing tax collectors blind. These fragments hint at real men whose exploits might have inspired the myth. But here's the twist: medieval England was crawling with outlaws. Why did this name stick? Maybe because Robin's story gave ordinary people something rare, a hero who wasn't a knight or a king, but someone like them, punching up at a system rigged in favor of the powerful. Whether he existed or not, the fact that his legend outlived empires tells us something profound about the hopes of the people who kept his name alive. Buried in the dusty court rolls of 13th century England lies the first spark of the Robin Hood legend, a single line from 1226 that mentions a fugitive in Yorkshire named Robert Hood. No green tights, no merry men, just a stark legal record branding him as an outlaw. But here's where it gets interesting. Scribes often spelled names phonetically back then, and over time, Hod morphed into Hood, or Hood like a game of medieval telephone. Even more intriguing, other records from the same era mention outlaws with eerily similar names like Hobbyhod or Robin Hood, scattered across different regions. Were these all the same man? Unlikely, but it suggests something bigger. Robin Hood might have been a nickname for any outlaw who defied authority, a title passed down like a badge of honor among rebels. One theory points to Robert Hood of Wakefield, a man tangled in the bloody aftermath of a failed rebellion against King Edward II. Stripped of his lands, he might have vanished into the woods, prime material for a folk hero. Then there's Roger Godbird, an actual outlaw who hid in Sherwood, robbed tax collectors, and became such a nuisance that the sheriff offered a reward for his head. Sound familiar? These real-life figures didn't just inspire the legend, they blurred into it, their deeds folded into one iconic character like layers of an onion. But why did this name endure when others faded? Maybe because Robin was medieval shorthand for every common man, like John Doe with a longbow. Hoods, meanwhile, were the anonymity cloaks of their day, worn by hunters and outlaws alike. Put them together and you've got the perfect folk hero, a nameless, faceless rebel who could be anyone or everyone. The court roll from 1226 isn't just a legal footnote. It's the first frayed thread of a story that would weave itself into the fabric of history, growing taller with each telling until the man disappeared behind the myth. To understand why Robin Hood's legend took root, we have to step into the chaos of medieval England, a world where kings bled their subjects dry and sheriffs acted more like thieves than keepers of the peace. Picture this, the year is 1200 and King John sits on the throne, a man so hated that chroniclers wrote he suffered torment in hell the moment he died. His reign was a perfect storm of misery, sky-high taxes to fund failed wars, corrupt officials pocketing grain from starving villages, and forests like Sherwood turned into traps where royal gamekeepers could arrest a peasant for hunting a deer to feed his family. No wonder outlaws became folk heroes when the law itself is the villain. Breaking it starts to look like justice. This wasn't just Robin's world, it was the powder keg that fueled real rebellions like the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, where tens of thousands marched on London, burning tax records and shouting the same grievances echoed in the ballads. Why should we starve while the lords feast? The revolt was crushed, of course, but its spirit lived on in stories. That's the key to understanding Robin Hood's appeal. He wasn't just a lone wolf in the woods, he was the fantasy of every peasant who ever watched a sheriff take their last cow as taxes. The ballads gave them a version of the Peasants' Revolt where the underdog won, where a man with a bow could humble the powerful and walk away laughing. And here's the twist, many so-called outlaws weren't criminals at all. Some were freemen fleeing debt, others were farmers whose lands got stolen by nobles using forged deeds. The line between outlaw and rebel blurred depending on who told the story. Take Hereward the Wake, a real resistance fighter who harassed Norman invaders after the conquest of 1066 centuries before Robin, but cut from the same cloth. Or Eustace the Monk, a pirate who turned his raids into a personal war against corrupt clergy. These men became legends because they did what ordinary people couldn't, they fought back. That's why the Robin Hood myth outlasted the Middle Ages. He wasn't just a character, he was a mirror held up to every era's injustices. When taxes crushed the poor, when sheriffs sold favors, when the forests were guarded more fiercely than the churches, people whispered his name. Because in a world where the law was just another weapon of the powerful, the only hero left was the man who broke it. Sherwood Forest stretches across the English countryside like a living, breathing fortress, its ancient oaks twisted into natural hiding places, its underbrush thick enough to swallow a man whole. To modern visitors, it's a tourist attraction with gift shops and walking trails. But 800 years ago, it was a different world, a lawless labyrinth where a skilled archer could vanish without a trace. So was Sherwood just a convenient backdrop for ballads, or did it truly shelter outlaws like Robin Hood? The answer lies somewhere between the trees and the dirt beneath them. Archaeologists have combed Sherwood for decades, turning up arrowheads, makeshift hearths, and even the remains of hidden shelters woven into the forest's densest thickets. These weren't the cozy camps of Hollywood, these were survivalist hideouts designed to be invisible from the road, and Sherwood's geography made it perfect for ambushes. Unlike the manicured woods of fairy tales, this forest was part of a vast royal hunting ground, patrolled by gamekeepers who'd arrest anyone caught poaching deer. But for outlaws, that same isolation was a gift. The forest's sheer size, over 100,000 acres in its medieval prime, meant a small band could strike a tax collector's caravan near Nottingham and disappear into the wilderness before the sheriff's men saddled their horses. Yet Sherwood's role goes deeper than just practical hideouts. In medieval England, forests were symbols of royal oppression. The infamous forest laws reserved game like deer and boar for the king's table, while starving peasants faced mutilation for taking a single rabbit. When ballads placed Robin in Sherwood, they weren't just picking a random location, they were planting his flag in the heart of the system he defied. Every deer he poached was a thumb in the eye of the crown. Every ambush on a wealthy traveler sent a message: this land belongs to the people, not the king's greedy sheriffs. The forest also played tricks on the imagination. Locals swore it was haunted by spirits, by outlaws, or maybe by both. Stories spread of travelers who vanished without a sound, their purses left dangling from branches like macabre fruit. Whether these tales were warnings or propaganda, they fed the myth. A forest that could make men disappear was the perfect stage for a hero who lived between truth and legend. Today, you can still walk Sherwood's paths and feel the weight of that history. The major oak, a gnarled giant said to be Robin's hideout, stands hollowed out by time, its trunk wide enough to shelter a dozen men. Of course, the tree's real age puts it a few centuries too young for Robin's era. But that's the thing about legends, they bend the landscape to fit the story. Whether Robin Hood hid under these specific branches hardly matters. What matters is that for 800 years people believed he could have, and in the end that belief might be the most real thing about him. The Sheriff of Nottingham stands frozen in legend as the mustache-twirling villain, scheming in his castle while Robin Hood outwits him at every turn. But history paints a far murkier picture, one where the line between tyrant and trapped official blurs under the weight of medieval justice. To understand the real sheriff, we need to peel back the layers of folklore and step into the brutal machinery of 12th century England. First, let's shatter the myth. There was no single Sheriff of Nottingham in Robin's time. The title rotated among local nobles appointed by the crown, and their job was less about twirling daggers and more about enforcing the king's will no matter how unpopular. Picture a tax collector with a sword, squeezed between a monarch demanding gold and peasants who'd sooner starve than pay. Records from the reign of King John reveal sheriffs were so despised that one was dragged from his horse and beaten to death by a mob. Yet many were just cogs in a broken system, following orders under threat of losing their own lands or heads. Take Philip Mark, sheriff from 1209 to 1224, a man so notoriously corrupt that chroniclers accused him of taking bribes and seizing land by force. But even his cruelty had a context. King John's wars drained the treasury, and sheriffs like Mark were under pressure to squeeze every penny from their districts. Failure meant disgrace or worse. Other sheriffs like William de Wendinel tried to walk a tighter line, balancing royal demands with occasional mercy. Court rolls show he pardoned petty thieves during famines, hinting at a man aware of the desperation around him. Here's the twist: many sheriffs weren't even based in Nottingham. The castle we associate with the legend was often just a seasonal stop on a grueling circuit, where they held court in muddy market squares, adjudicating everything from stolen pigs to bloody feuds. No dungeons, no jeweled robes, just a weary official doling out punishments under a tree, and those punishments often dictated by harsh forest laws that made felons of hunters and farmers alike. The sheriff didn't write those laws, he just enforced them, becoming the face of a system far crueler than any one man. Yet the ballads weren't entirely wrong. Some sheriffs did exploit their power, like John of Oxenford, who pocketed fines meant for the crown and framed rivals as outlaws, but even he pales next to fictional counterparts. The real villain wasn't a person, it was a system where sheriffs, peasants, and even Robin Hood, if he existed, were pawns in a game rigged by distant kings. So was the sheriff a villain sometimes, a bureaucrat always, and that's why the legend stuck. It's easier to blame a single corrupt official than to grapple with the truth. That tyranny often wears a crown, not a black cloak. The sheriff became the perfect scapegoat, a face for the faceless machine that crushed the poor. And in making him the foil, the ballads gave audiences a victory that real medieval life rarely offered: the chance to see the system's enforcer humbled, even if only in song. The name Robin Hood might conjure images of a single dashing outlaw, but history offers a far messier and more intriguing reality. Peel back the layers of legend, and you'll find not one man but a puzzle of identities, each with its own compelling evidence. Was he a fallen nobleman, a common rebel, or something even stranger? Let's untangle the top theories, starting with the most romantic, Robin of Locksley. This version, popularized by later ballads and Hollywood, paints Robin as a disgraced knight stripped of his lands, a man with the training to fight and the motive to rebel. Historian J.C. Holt points to records of nobles like Robert Fitz-Odo, a knight who lost his estate after opposing King John and may have turned outlaw. The appeal is obvious. A blue-blooded hero fighting for justice fits neatly into medieval tropes of chivalry. But here's the catch: early ballads never mention Locksley or noble roots. Instead, they call Robin a yeoman, a term for small landowners or skilled laborers. That's a far cry from a knight's pedigree, hinting that the aristocratic Robin might be a later invention to gentrify the legend. Then there's the yeoman theory. These were men caught between the peasantry and the gentry, free but vulnerable to losing everything if a lord decided their land looked tempting. In a time when the legal system favored the powerful, a yeoman turned outlaw would resonate deeply with common folk. Court rolls from the 1300s mention men like Roger Godberd, a real outlaw who raided Sherwood after being cheated out of his inheritance. Sound familiar? Godberd's story mirrors Robin so closely that some historians argue he's the prototype. But the most fascinating idea is that Robin Hood wasn't a person at all, just a name slapped onto any outlaw tale that needed a hero. Medieval England teemed with rebel stories, from Hereward the Wake to Eustace the Monk. Over time, their exploits could have merged into a single archetype, a brand of resistance. Ballads were oral tradition before they were written down, changing with each telling. A good story wasn't about accuracy, it was about catharsis, giving listeners a vicarious thrill as the underdog triumphed. So who was he? The unsatisfying truth is that all these theories might hold a piece of the answer. Robin Hood could be a patchwork, a real yeoman's grievances woven with a knight's daring, stitched together by generations of singers who needed a hero to root for. That's the magic of the legend. It's elastic enough to fit whatever justice a listener craved. Whether he was one man or many, his real power lies in the fact that 8 centuries later we're still debating and still hoping someone like him might be out there. Maid Marian didn't always ride through Sherwood Forest with Robin Hood. In fact, she's a latecomer to the legend, arriving centuries after the first ballads were sung. Picture this: the earliest Robin Hood stories, scrawled in the 1300s, are a boys' club of bandits and brawls. No Marian, no romance, just a band of outlaws living rough in the woods. So where did she come from? To find her origins, we have to cross the English Channel and step into the sun-drenched world of French pastoral plays, where she first appeared as a shepherdess named Marian, frolicking with her lover Robin in idealized countryside tales. By the 1500s, Marian finally leapt into the Robin Hood mythos, but not as the fierce archer or noblewoman we know today. At first, she was little more than a decorative figure, a May Day festival character draped in flowers, dancing around maypoles. The English folded her into their outlaw stories almost as an afterthought, merging French pastoral charm with gritty English rebellion. Yet over time, she transformed from a background player into Robin's equal, wielding a bow and matching his cunning. The question is, why could Marian's rise reflect real medieval women who defied expectations, or is she pure fantasy? Dig into historical records and you'll find women who are anything but passive. Take Matilda Fitzwalter, a noblewoman who supposedly inspired Marian legend, says she defied King John's advances and paid with her life. Then there's the infamous Maud or Moll Cutpurse, a 17th century highwaywoman who dressed in men's clothes and terrorized travelers with a pistol. These women were outliers in a society that demanded obedience, but their stories prove rebellion wasn't just a man's game. Marian's evolution might echo their defiance, giving the legend a new dimension, not just a hero, but a partnership where love and resistance intertwined. Yet Marian's most fascinating role isn't just as a character, it's as a mirror. In a world where women's stories were often erased or rewritten, her presence in the Robin Hood tales shifted with the times. Victorian versions turned her into a damsel, while modern retellings make her a warrior. Each era's Marian says less about medieval England and more about the people who resurrected her. Whether inspired by real rebels or born from French poetry, she became something just as powerful, proof that even in the oldest legends there's always room for reinvention. Friar Tuck, that jovial rogue of Sherwood Forest with his ale-stained robes and quick fists, might seem like pure fiction, a comic relief character dreamed up to balance Robin's noble idealism. But dig into the archives and you'll stumble upon a bombshell. A court record from 1417 that mentions a Friar Tuck accused of various trespasses and offenses. No merry feasts by the river here, just a real clergyman with a rap sheet. This single line cracks open a door to a shadowy world where holy men weren't always pious, and the church's power could breed corruption as easily as virtue. The record paints a stark contrast to the folktales. This Friar Tuck wasn't stealing gold for the poor, he was tangled in property disputes, possibly even violence. And he wasn't alone. Medieval England swarmed with hedge priests, unlicensed clerics who performed rogue baptisms, gave absolution for a fee, or outright joined outlaw bands when the church cast them out. For peasants, these men were both salvation and scandal. Spiritual guides who knew the Bible, but also the backroads where stolen goods changed hands. Friar Tuck's legend likely grew from this tension, the idea that even God's servants could be flawed, even rebellious. But why did storytellers embrace such a morally grey character? Because the medieval church was a powder keg. Monasteries hoarded land while parishes starved. Bishops lived like kings while village priests barely scraped by. When ballads showed Friar Tuck brawling with Robin only to join his band after losing, it wasn't just slapstick, it was a fantasy where the church's hypocrisy got punched in the face, then redeemed itself by siding with the people. The real kicker, some historians think Tuck wasn't even a name but a slang term for a knife, hinting at a far darker figure than the ale-loving friar we know. Yet that's the genius of folklore. It sanded down the rough edges, turning a possibly violent renegade into a symbol of subversion with a heart of gold. Friar Tuck's evolution reminds us that every legend starts with a seed of truth, and sometimes the most enduring characters are the ones who let us laugh at the very institutions we fear. Tucked away in the quiet churchyard of St. Michael's in Hathersage, Derbyshire, lies a weathered grave marked by ancient stone. Local legend insists this is the final resting place of Little John, Robin Hood's loyal giant, whose strength was matched only by his wit. But here's where history takes a strange turn. When archaeologists opened the grave in the 19th century, they uncovered a skeleton measuring over 7 feet long. Suddenly, a folktale felt shockingly real. So was this the real Little John, or just a coincidence that fed the myth? The answer lies somewhere between science and storytelling. Carbon dating places the bones in the 13 or 1400s, the perfect era for Robin Hood's band. But before we jump to conclusions, consider this. Medieval England had its share of unusually tall individuals, often hired as royal bodyguards or feared mercenaries. A 7-foot skeleton might be rare, but not impossible. What's more intriguing is the grave's location. Hathersage sits on the edge of the Peak District, a rugged landscape dotted with caves and hidden valleys perfect for outlaws. Local records even mention a John Little who owned land nearby before vanishing into obscurity. Coincidence or evidence, the villagers of Hathersage have no doubt. For centuries, they've tended the grave like a shrine, passing down stories of how Little John returned here to die, his famed quarterstaff buried beside him. In the 1800s, souvenir hunters allegedly stole bones and even the staff, leaving the grave emptier but the legend richer. Yet historians remain divided. Some argue the skeleton's size and timing make it plausible. Others counter that ballads placed Little John's death in Yorkshire, not Derbyshire, proof that communities often adopted famous outlaws to boost their own prestige. Here's where folklore and science collide. Without DNA or definitive records, we can't prove this was Robin's right-hand man, but that misses the point. What matters is why the story stuck. In a world where the powerful wrote history, graves like this gave ordinary people a tangible connection to rebellion, a place to whisper grievances and hope. Whether the bones belong to Little John or not, they remind us that legends don't just live in books. They're buried in the earth, waiting for us to dig them up and decide what to believe. The ballad of Robin Hood's death reads less like a heroic finale and more like a grim medieval thriller bleeding from a treacherous wound. The outlaw fires one last arrow from the window of Kirklees Priory, telling Little John to bury him wherever it lands. It's a scene soaked in betrayal, with none of the swashbuckling triumph Hollywood loves. But here's the twist: Kirklees Priory, the supposed site of his murder, still stands today in West Yorkshire, its crumbling walls guarding a grave that's been called Robin's for centuries. So did he really die there, or is this another layer of myth wrapped around a deeper truth? Let's start with the ballad itself, Robin Hood's Death, written in the 1500s but likely based on older oral tales. In it, Robin seeks medical help from the prioress of Kirklees, a woman either related to him or romantically entangled, depending on the version. But instead of healing him, she bleeds him to death, possibly at the sheriff's bidding. The details are murky, but one thing's clear: this isn't a noble end. It's a whispered warning about trust and power, where even a hero can fall to a knife in the dark. The arrow shot, then, becomes a final act of defiance, a way to control his own burial in a world that denied him justice in life. Now, step into the overgrown grounds of Kirklees Priory today, and you'll find a weathered stone slab beneath an old oak, marked with fading letters that claim it's Robin's grave. The site has drawn pilgrims and skeptics for generations, but here's the catch. The earliest record of the grave only dates back to the 1600s, a full 3 centuries after Robin's supposed death. Even then, antiquarians noted the inscription looked suspiciously fresh for a medieval tomb. Some argue the grave was a publicity stunt by the priory's owners, capitalizing on the legend to draw visitors, a medieval tourist trap. Yet locals swear the story runs deeper. Kirklees was a real nunnery with a reputation for corruption. Records show its prioress in the 1300s, one Elizabeth de Stainton, was accused of financial mismanagement and even affairs with outlaws. Could she have inspired the treacherous prioress of the ballads? It's possible, but the priory's connection to Robin might be darker still. Some historians suggest Kirklees wasn't just a random setting, it was a deliberate symbol. Nunneries were often accused of hiding criminals for bribes, and their ties to local nobility made them ripe for tales of betrayal. By placing Robin's death there, the ballad might have been skewering the church's complicity with the powerful. Then there's the arrow itself. Folklore claims it flew an impossible distance over a mile before landing near a stream. That's pure fantasy, of course, but the spot it supposedly hit, now called Robin Hood's grave, has been dug up multiple times. 18th century treasure hunters even claimed to find bones and arrowheads, though these vanished mysteriously. Modern archaeologists roll their eyes, but the persistence of the legend speaks volumes. Whether Robin died at Kirklees or not, the site became a place where people could touch a story that defied authority, even in its tragic end. So was Robin Hood really buried under that oak? Probably not, but the power of the tale isn't in its facts, it's in the raw emotion it carries. His death isn't just an ending, it's a reminder that every rebellion, no matter how glorious, risks being undone by the very institutions it challenges. The grave at Kirklees might be a fraud, but the message etched into its myth is real. Heroes don't always get happy endings. Sometimes they just get a place where the defiant can gather to remember. Imagine a dimly lit tavern in 14th century England, the air thick with smoke and the clatter of tankards. A minstrel strums his lute and begins a familiar tune, the crowd leaning in as he sings of Robin Hood's latest triumph over the sheriff. But beneath the rollicking chorus, something far more subversive is at work. Ballads like A Jest of Robin Hood weren't just entertainment. They were medieval memes, carefully crafted to poke at the raw wounds of feudalism while dodging the king's censors. The Jest, the oldest surviving long ballad about Robin, reads like a blueprint for rebellion. In one scene, Robin ambushes a knight who's been stripped of his lands by a greedy abbot. Instead of robbing him, Robin loans him money to reclaim his estate, then helps him strong-arm the church into repayment. It's a fantasy of feudal justice turned upside down, where the outlaw plays banker, judge, and executioner. Historians like Stephen Knight argue this wasn't accidental. The ballads transformed criminals into folk heroes because they channeled widespread rage against a system where lords and clergy held all the power and abused it freely. But here's the genius: the songs never directly incited violence. They didn't have to. By painting Robin as a man who did poor men much good, they framed resistance as moral, even holy. When a starving peasant heard verses about Robin redistributing the bishop's gold, it wasn't just a story, it was a dare, and the church knew it. Records show clergy condemning Robin Hood plays as spectacles of disobedience, while authorities in Scotland outright banned them. Yet the ballads spread like wildfire, passed mouth to mouth because they gave voice to frustrations that couldn't be spoken aloud. The tunes themselves were weaponized. Sung to jaunty, repetitive melodies, they were designed to stick in the mind. A farmer humming Robin's exploits while working the fields was subtly reinforcing the idea that the system could be beaten. Even the famous refrain, "Robin Hood in Barnesdale stood," acted as a rallying cry, tying the legend to real places where outlaws allegedly roamed. And when rebellions like the Peasants' Revolt erupted, rebels invoked Robin's name not because he'd led them, but because the ballads had spent decades priming them to see tyranny as something that should be resisted. Yet the ballads weren't pure propaganda. They also served as cautionary tales. In Robin Hood and the Monk, our hero is captured after ignoring Little John's advice, a reminder that even the cleverest rebels could fall. These nuances suggest the songs were more than just rebel anthems. They were a coping mechanism for a brutal world, offering both wish fulfillment and warnings. For every verse where Robin outwits the sheriff, there's another where violence begets violence or loyalty is betrayed. So were the ballads medieval protest songs. Absolutely, but their real power lay in their ambiguity. They let listeners decide, was Robin a warning, a role model, or just a thrilling escape? That flexibility made them dangerous. Because when a legend can be all things to all people, it doesn't just reflect rebellion, it fuels it. By the time you reach the later ballads, Robin Hood isn't just a woodland rogue. He's a war-weary crusader, returning from the Holy Land with a quiver full of arrows and a grudge against Prince John. This twist, added centuries after the earliest stories, transforms him from a local outlaw into a hero tangled in national myth. But why did storytellers suddenly ship Robin off to fight in the Crusades? The answer lies in the medieval obsession with Richard the Lionheart, a king who spent more time abroad than in England and became a legend in his absence. Richard's reign was a paradox, celebrated as the ideal warrior king. He bankrupted his kingdom to fund his campaigns, leaving his brother John to scrape together taxes with increasingly brutal methods. Yet by the 1400s and 1500s, nostalgia had painted Richard as England's golden boy, a just ruler contrasted with John's tyranny. Linking Robin to Richard's crusades wasn't just a plot device, it was a way to graft the outlaw's populist appeal onto a royalist narrative. Suddenly, Robin wasn't just stealing from corrupt sheriffs, he was fighting for the true king, his crimes legitimized by loyalty. The ballads lean hard into this shift. In Robin Hood and the Monk, Richard appears incognito to pardon Robin after testing his merit, a scene dripping with medieval wish fulfillment. The message: even the greatest king recognizes Hood's virtue. This version of Robin dovetails with the medieval cult of chivalry, where knights like Sir Gawain or the Crusaders themselves were expected to balance martial prowess with mercy. By making Robin a returned crusader, storytellers gave him a glossy coat of honor, sanding off the rough edges of his earlier, more violent tales. But here's the irony: Richard's real crusade record was muddier than the ballads suggest. He massacred prisoners at Acre, sparred with allies, and got captured on his way home, hardly the stuff of noble legend. Yet his myth outshone reality just as Robin's did. That's the alchemy of medieval storytelling. Take two semi-historical figures, swirl them together, and create a shared fantasy where righteous might wins. The Crusades connection also explains Robin's sudden upgrade in skills. Early ballads show him as a talented archer, but the later Crusader Robin is a swordsman, horseman, and tactician, traits borrowed from returning knights' reputations. Even his iconic green garb gets a quasi-religious gloss in some versions, with hints it symbolizes a crusader's vow. These details weren't just decorative, they reflected a society wrestling with its own history. England's crusading era was long over by the 1500s, but the stories let audiences relive or reimagine that time when faith, violence, and heroism blurred. Most tellingly, the Crusades' angle gave Robin's rebellion a get-out-of-jail-free card. Defying Prince John wasn't treason if you were secretly serving Richard. It's no accident this twist gained traction during the Tudor era, when questioning authority could mean losing your head. The ballads offered a safe space to critique power disguised as loyalty to a greater king. Whether Robin ever drew a sword in Jerusalem hardly matters. What matters is that by sending him there, storytellers turned a thorn in the sheriff's side into a patriot. And in doing so, they proved legends don't just grow. They evolve to fit the fears and hopes of every new age. Robin Hood wasn't the only shadowy figure haunting England's forests. Medieval Europe teemed with real-life outlaws whose exploits blurred into his legend. Take Eustace the Monk, a French pirate turned rebel who waged a one-man war against the crown in the early 1200s. Born a nobleman, Eustace turned to piracy after a feud with his lord, raiding ships along the Channel with a crew of excommunicated priests and runaway serfs. At one point, he even held the island of Sark as his personal fortress, mocking the king's navy from its cliffs. sound familiar, Eustace's story mirrors Robin's in eerie ways: a disgraced noble, a band of misfits, a knack for humiliating authority. But here's the twist. His legend predates Robin's by decades, suggesting his exploits might have been grafted onto the Hood myth as ballads traveled across borders. Then there's Fulk Fitzwarren, a marcher lord who became an outlaw after losing a legal battle with King John, yes, the same king who torments Robin in later tales. Fulk's gang hid in the forests of Shropshire, ambushing royal tax collectors and burning sheriff's manors. Chronicles from the 1200s describe him disguising himself as a charcoal burner to evade capture, a trick Robin would later borrow in ballads. But unlike Robin, Fulk's rebellion had an end game. He eventually bargained his way back into the king's favor, trading his outlaw fame for restored lands. That pragmatic streak reveals a harsher truth. Most medieval bandits didn't live long enough to become legends unless they cut deals with the powerful. The gang that might have influenced Robin most directly, though, lurked in Yorkshire's Barnsdale Forest, a real-life hideout mentioned in early ballads. Court rolls from the 1300s describe a band of ex-soldiers turned highwaymen, led by a man named Roger Godbird. Like Robin, they specialized in robbing church officials and corrupt sheriffs, once even kidnapping a justice of the peace. Local peasants reportedly sheltered them, just as Sherwood's villagers aided Robin. When Godbird was finally captured, he escaped Nottingham Castle by climbing down a rope made of bedsheets, a scene straight out of folklore. Historians like David Baldwin argue Godbird's gang was the template for the Merry Men, their deeds polished into poetry over generations. What sets Robin apart from these real outlaws, though, isn't his methods, it's his mythos. Eustace died beheaded by an English ship's crew. Fulk traded his rebellion for a title. Godbird vanished into obscurity after his pardon, but Robin Hood's story kept growing, absorbing bits of their lives like a sponge. Because legends don't need happy endings, they need hope. A Eustace or a Fulk could win battles, but only Robin Hood never stopped fighting. That's why his name outlasted them all. In a world where real rebels fell or compromised, he became the one who never had to. By 1381, England was a tinderbox. King Richard II's poll taxes had pushed starving villagers to the brink. And when Wat Tyler's rebels marched on London, they didn't just carry pitchforks, they carried stories. Among the chants for justice, whispers of Robin Hood threaded through the crowds like smoke. Here was a figure who'd spent centuries in ballads, robbing the wealthy and mocking authority, now repurposed as a battle cry for real revolution. But was Robin merely a comforting myth, or did the rebels see him as a blueprint? The answer lies in the fiery overlap of folklore and fury. The peasants' revolt wasn't just about taxes, it was a wholesale rejection of feudal oppression. Villagers burned manorial records, symbols of the legal chains binding them to lords' lands, and in their rhetoric, echoes of Robin Hood's world rang clear. Take the rebels' demand: no lord shall have lordship over men, but all shall be free and of one condition. That sentiment could have been ripped straight from the jest of Robin Hood, where the outlaw declares, "What I take from the overproud, I give to the ploughman." The parallels aren't coincidence. Balladeers had spent decades sharpening Robin's story into a weapon. Now the peasants wielded it, yet the revolt's leaders seemed to channel Robin's tactics as much as his ideals. Wat Tyler's men targeted tax collectors and church officials, the very figures Robin humiliated in ballads. They even mimicked his flair for spectacle. When rebels stormed the Tower of London, they dragged out the Archbishop of Canterbury, a man synonymous with corrupt clerical wealth, and beheaded him on Tower Hill. It's hard not to see the ghost of Robin's feud with the Sheriff of Nottingham in that act, but the most telling detail, chronicles report rebels invoking Robin's name as they torched John of Gaunt's Savoy Palace. To them, this wasn't arson, it was redistributive justice, live and unscripted. The establishment's reaction proves how potent the connection was. After crushing the revolt, authorities banned Robin Hood plays and ballads, labeling them incitements to disorder. Church sermons denounced outlaws as devilish, while chroniclers scrubbed references to Robin from official accounts. Why such fear over a fictional character? Because legends are slippery, Robin Hood stories gave peasants a shared language of resistance, one that couldn't be confiscated like a sword. Even the Revolt's failure couldn't erase that. But here's the twist: Robin's role in 1381 might have been more mirror than motivator. The Revolt's grievances, land enclosures, unfair laws, clerical greed, were the same injustices ballads had railed against for generations. Robin didn't inspire the rebellion, he'd been articulating its core values all along. When Tyler's men shouted his name, they weren't summoning a hero, they were recognizing themselves in a story that had always belonged to them. The aftermath cemented Robin's evolution from local hero to national symbol. As the crown cracked down, his ballads spread further, now tinged with the Revolt's martyrs. A new edge entered the tales, darker, angrier. The jest added scenes of Robin executing corrupt abbots, while older ballads were rewritten to show him targeting the king's deer, a direct jab at forest laws that had fueled rebel rage. Robin Hood wasn't just a character anymore, he was a vessel for unfinished revolution. And that's why, 6 centuries later, we still debate whether he was real. The truth might not matter. What matters is that for a few weeks in 1381, he was real enough to haunt the nightmares of kings. Long before Robin Hood was a folk hero battling sheriffs, he may have been something far older, a spirit of the forest woven into the ancient rituals of England's pagan past. Picture this, the 1st of May, when villages erupted in chaos as young men crowned with flowers raced into the woods at dawn, hunting for the sacred hawthorn. They'd return with branches declaring a king of the May to preside over a day of dancing, feasting, and rule-breaking, and sometimes that king wore a hood of green. This was the world of the Greenwood cult, a shadowy tradition that blurred the line between man and myth. Figures like Herne the Hunter, a ghostly woodsman with antlers who led spectral hunts, shared eerie similarities with Robin. Both were lords of the wild, guardians of the forest's lawless freedom. Both thrived in the liminal spaces between civilization and wilderness where normal rules didn't apply. Even Robin's signature color carries deeper meaning. Green wasn't just camouflage, it was the hue of life, fertility, and the untamed forces that defied human order. When medieval peasants donned green for May Day, they weren't just celebrating spring, they were channeling something primal. The rituals tell the story. May Day was a time of inverted roles where servants became masters, and the poor could mock the rich without punishment. Sound familiar? It's the same subversive energy that fuels Robin Hood's legend. In some villages, a Robin Hood figure even led the festivities, a temporary king who embodied the wildness of the woods before order was restored. Scholars like Margaret Murray argue these traditions weren't just games. They were echoes of pre-Christian rites where the May King symbolized the cyclical rebirth of nature. But here's where history gets slippery. The church, desperate to stamp out pagan remnants, often rebranded these rituals as Christian festivals. Robin's link to May Day might explain why he survived where other forest spirits faded. His legend was flexible enough to absorb both pagan roots and medieval morality. Even his name hints at deeper layers. Robin was a nickname for woodland spirits in folk tales, while Hood could reference the secrecy of the greenwood or even the hooded dancers in May Day processions. The evidence lingers in unexpected places. In the 16th century, church records complain of villagers going to the woods to fetch home Robin Hood as part of May Games, proof that for some, he was never just a man but a force of nature itself. Whether as a remnant of forgotten gods or a symbol of rebellion against the modern world, Robin's ties to these rituals remind us that the oldest stories aren't just told, they're lived season after season in the dappled light beneath the trees. The earliest Robin Hood ballads paint a picture far removed from the gallant hero we know today. In Robin Hood and the Monk, written in the 15th century, we meet an outlaw who murders a monk in cold blood to silence a witness. No witty banter, no noble cause, just survival at any cost. This Robin isn't stealing from the rich to feed the poor. He's a hardened criminal who prays to the Virgin Mary one moment and slits throats the next. Even his famous generosity has limits. When Little John questions his leadership, Robin nearly beheads him in a fit of rage. These stories weren't morality tales, they were gritty survival sagas, reflecting a world where violence was currency and trust was luxury. Fast forward to the 16th century, and the legend begins to soften. Printed broadside ballads add scenes of Robin aiding starving peasants, while his fights with sheriffs take on a clearer moral dimension. The jest of Robin Hood reframes his robberies as loans to fallen knights, painting him as a rough but fair banker of the woods. Scholars trace this shift to the Protestant Reformation, where anti-clerical sentiment made Robin's raids on corrupt abbots resonate as acts of divine justice. Suddenly, the cutthroat becomes a crusader, still violent, but now with a cause. By the Victorian era, Robin Hood undergoes a full transformation. Writers like Howard Pyle dress him in emerald velvet and saddle him with a Dickensian sense of social duty. Gone are the bloody grudges and ambushes. This Robin is a clean-cut rebel, robbing tax collectors to fund orphanages and schools. The Victorians, obsessed with chivalry and charity, sanded off his edges until he resembled a feudal-era philanthropist. Even his relationship with Maid Marian gets a chaste makeover, scrubbed of any hint of the lusty energy found in medieval May-Day plays where the characters first met. The 20th century adds new layers. Socialist writers recast Robin as a proto-Marxist, redistributing wealth in an early class war. Hollywood, meanwhile, leans into the swashbuckling charm, turning him into a romantic lead who happens to rob nobles between sword fights. Each era molds Robin to its needs, whether as a symbol of resistance, a template for masculinity, or a vessel for nostalgia. What's fascinating isn't just how Robin changes, but why we keep rewriting him. The medieval ballads spoke to a world where life was cheap and power was brutal. The Victorians needed a hero who proved their own benevolence. Modern retellings grapple with inequality, spinning him as everything from an anti-capitalist firebrand to a libertarian vigilante. The real magic of Robin Hood isn't in any single version. It's in the way his story bends without breaking, proving that the best legends aren't carved in stone, but written in the shifting sand of human need. In medieval England, the longbow wasn't just a weapon, it was a symbol of national pride, a tool of survival, and for a time, a legal obligation. Every able-bodied man between 15 and 60 had to practice archery by royal decree, with fines for skipping Sunday training. Villages held weekly contests, and the best shots earned respect, extra ale, and sometimes even exemption from taxes. This was the world that shaped Robin Hood's legendary marksmanship, not just as a solitary skill, but as a reflection of an entire class of yeomen who took fierce pride in their ability to loose an arrow straight and true. The longbow's dominance wasn't accidental. At battles like Crecy and Agincourt, English archers rained down arrows that could pierce armor at 200 yards, turning the tide against heavily armored French knights. But mastering the longbow required years of grueling practice, drawing a 100-pound bow repeatedly until your muscles memorized the motion. That's why King Edward III made archery practice compulsory in 1363. He wanted a ready army of deadly accurate yeomen. For the farmers and craftsmen who formed Robin's class, the bow became a great equalizer. A skilled archer could defend his home, feed his family, and if pushed too far, stand against even a knight's sword. This culture of archery birthed traditions that feel ripped straight from the ballads. Take the Scourton Arrow, a contest dating back to 1673 in Yorkshire. Competitors aimed at a tiny target almost 300 yards away, and the winner became Captain of the Arrow for the year, a title echoing Robin's leadership of his merry men. Earlier, in the 1400s, towns like Finsbury and London hosted grand tournaments where archers shot for silver arrows, their victories celebrated like knightly jousts. Robin's famous contests against the sheriff or rivals like Guy of Gisborne mirror these real events, where skill with a bow could humble social superiors and rewrite reputations. But there's a darker layer to this connection. The same laws that mandated archery practice also forbade other sports like football, which were seen as distractions from martial training. Authorities feared gatherings of armed commoners, especially after rebellions like the Peasants' Revolt. When Robin Hood ballads show him outshooting nobles and sheriffs, they're tapping into a very real tension, the knowledge that the lower classes held a weapon and the power to resist. An arrow didn't care about titles, it flew where it was aimed, whether by a lord or a landless man. That's why Robin's archery matters beyond the spectacle. His unmatched skill with the bow wasn't just a plot device, it was a metaphor for the quiet strength of the yeoman class. In a society where birth dictated destiny, the longbow offered a rare meritocracy. And when ballads showed Robin splitting a willow wand at 100 paces or winning golden arrows from the sheriff, they weren't just entertaining. They were reminding audiences that even in a rigged system, excellence could demand respect. The arrow, after all, is the great leveler, and in Robin Hood's hands it became the sharpest kind of justice. Nottingham wears its outlaw legacy like a well-worn green cloak everywhere you turn. Robin Hood's presence looms larger than life. Walk through the city centre and you'll trip over his bronze footprints embedded in the pavement, leading you past the towering statue of him drawing his bow outside Castle Gate. Pop into a pub and there's his face on the ale tap. Even the airport bears his name, welcoming visitors with a giant Robin Hood Airport sign that feels like a wink from the past. This isn't just history, it's a full-blown industry. Nottingham rakes in millions from tourists who come hunting for Sherwood Forest shadow, proving that a 13th-century-old outlaw might just be the city's most reliable breadwinner. But the relationship isn't all merry men and souvenir shops. Locals have a love-hate dance with their famous ghost. On one hand, Robin's branding is genius. What other city can claim a global icon who's been boosting its PR for 800 years? Annual events like the Robin Hood Festival transform the streets into a medieval carnival with archery displays, jesters, and enough feathered caps to outfit a dozen Sherwood reenactors. The tourist board even leans into the cheeky outlaw imagery with slogans like Nottingham, rebellious by nature, turning what was once a headache for medieval sheriffs into a modern marketing goldmine. Then there's the Robin Hood tax debate, a modern twist that would have made the original Outlaw smirk. In recent years, politicians and activists have floated the idea of a small tax on financial transactions, dubbing it the Robin Hood tax as a way to redistribute wealth from banks to public services. Nottingham's council once jokingly proposed applying it locally, sparking headlines like "Sheriff of Nottingham finally gets his revenge." The irony isn't lost on anyone, a city cashing in on a rebel's name now wrestling with how far to take his ethos. Yet scratch the glossy surface and you'll find tensions. Some historians groan that the tourism machine flattens Robin's complex legacy into family-friendly frolics, scrubbing away the gritty reality of medieval banditry. Purists mutter about the major oak, Sherwood's famed hollow tree marketed as Robin's hideout, despite dendrochronology proving it's centuries too young. And then there are the locals who roll their eyes at yet another Robin Hood-themed cafe because nothing says medieval outlaw like a 7-pound latte with a bow and arrow stencil in the foam. But here's the beautiful paradox. Nottingham doesn't just sell Robin Hood. It's stuck with him for better or worse. The city's identity is so tangled with the legend that even the soccer teams play it up. Nottingham Forest's crest features the outlaw, while rivals Derby County get cast as the villainous sheriff in fan chants. Walk into the council archives and you'll find centuries-old legal battles over who owns Robin, with towns from Yorkshire to Kent claiming him as their own. Nottingham won that war by sheer force of branding, even if the historical evidence is as thin as a ballad singer's parchment. So is Robin Hood tourism a tribute or a trap? Maybe both. The city thrives on his fame but also shoulders the weight of his myth. Every time a visitor asks where Maid Marian's grave is, there isn't one, or expects to see a literal merry men gang at the pub disappointing, Nottingham has to bridge the gap between fairy tale and fact. But perhaps that's the point. Robin Hood was never just a man, he was a mirror for whatever people needed him to be. And today, Nottingham's economy proves that even 800 years later, the legend still pays. Errol Flynn's Robin Hood didn't just swing onto the silver screen in 1938, he redefined the legend for a generation. Clad in technicolor green, with a jaunty feather in his cap and a quip always at the ready, Flynn turned the outlaw into a dashing swashbuckler, more charming rogue than desperate rebel. His Sherwood was a stage for acrobatic sword fights and romantic banter with Maid Marian, a far cry from the grim survival of the medieval ballads. This was Robin Hood as Hollywood fantasy, a hero who could outfight the sheriff with one hand while sweeping damsels off their feet with the other. The film's legacy lingers. It cemented the image of Robin as a nobleman in exile, a trope later adaptations would cling to even when history suggested otherwise. Disney's 1973 animated Robin Hood took a different tack, transforming the outlaw into a sly fox and the Sheriff of Nottingham into a comically inept wolf. This whimsical reinvention leaned into the story's folkloric roots, framing it as a playful fable about cunning triumphing over brute force. The animals weren't just a stylistic choice, they tapped into Aesop's tradition, where foxes symbolized trickery and lions stood for corrupt kings. Yet even here, beneath the catchy songs and bumbling villains, the film smuggled in hints of rebellion. When Robin robs Prince John's caravan to return gold to the poor, it's a kid-friendly nod to the legend's subversive heart. Then came Kevin Costner in 1991's Prince of Thieves, a film as infamous for its inconsistent accents as its sweeping score. Costner's Robin was an earnest crusader, returning from the Holy Land haunted by war, a far cry from Flynn's carefree charm. But the film's real legacy might be how it reshaped the merry men into a diverse band of outcasts, including a Moorish warrior whose presence, while historically debatable, hinted at a broader vision of resistance. Critics groaned at Costner's American vowels in medieval England, but the movie's darker tone, complete with a witch-hunting sheriff and a gnarled which signaled a shift toward grittier retellings. Ridley Scott's 2010 Robin Hood doubled down on that grit, stripping away the tights to give us a battle-hardened archer in chainmail. Russell Crowe's Robin wasn't stealing from the rich, he was unraveling a conspiracy that stretched to the throne itself. This was Hood as proto-revolutionary, a man caught in the machinations of power rather than a lone wolf in the woods. The film's muddy realism polarized audiences. Some missed the romance, others praised its historical heft, but it underscored how each era molds Robin to its anxieties. In a post-9/11 world, the enemy wasn't just a greedy sheriff. It was systemic corruption and the cost of war. Even smaller screen adaptations reflect their times. The BBC's 2006 series Robin Hood injected modern politics into Sherwood, with a Hood who preached social justice between arrow shots. Then there's Robin of Sherwood, the cult 80s show that blended Celtic mysticism with the legend, painting Robin as a pagan champion chosen by Herne the Hunter. Each version, whether campy or grave, reveals less about medieval England and more about the world that produced it. The magic of Robin Hood isn't just his ability to dodge arrows, it's his knack for dodging definition. He's a merry prankster, a hardened rebel, a fox in Disney's forest, or Crowe's weary soldier. The legend bends because it has to. It's not a relic, it's a mirror, reflecting back whatever we need to see in our own Sherwoods, whether that's hope, humor, or the hunger for a fight. That iconic Lincoln green tunic we associate with Robin Hood, it might be as fictional as his golden arrows. Historians digging into medieval textile records have found something startling. The vibrant shade immortalized by Hollywood didn't actually exist in Robin's era. The term Lincoln green first pops up in Tudor account books a full 3 centuries after the earliest ballads. So what did outlaw garb really look like? The truth is grittier and far more practical. Picture a medieval bandit blending into Sherwood's undergrowth. He wouldn't be wearing some nobleman's dyed wool, too expensive, too conspicuous. Instead, his tunic was likely the color of dirt and moss, woven from rough homespun cloth left undyed or stained with cheap local pigments. Woad, a plant used since Roman times, could produce murky blues while madder root yielded rusty reds. But achieving a consistent green required layering these dyes, a costly process for peasants. More probable, a hooded cloak of brownish gray patched with stolen scraps, helping him vanish into tree shadows. The Lincoln green myth probably grew from Tudor fashion trends. By the 1500s, advances in dyeing made brighter greens affordable, and the color became synonymous with skilled foresters who served royalty. Playwrights writing Robin Hood plays for urban audiences slapped this new green onto the outlaw to signal his woodland prowess. The anachronism stuck, reinforced by later artists who favored the visual punch of emerald against forest browns. Even Robin's famous hood deserves scrutiny. Medieval illustrations show laborers wearing simple, practical hoods, not the sleek, tailored versions seen in films. A real outlaw's hood would have been loose, perhaps lined with fur for winter, doubling as a sack or disguise when pulled low. The sheriff's men weren't hunting a man in trademark green. They were chasing a shadow in muted earth tones, indistinguishable from any other hunter or herder. This isn't just about fabric, it's about class. Flashy colors declared status in medieval England. Sumptuary laws actually banned commoners from wearing certain dyes, reserving rich purples and scarlets for nobility. A peasant flaunting Lincoln green would have been arrested for audacity long before theft. The real outlaw's new survival meant invisibility, both in the woods and in society's strict hierarchies. So why does the myth endure? Because Lincoln green feels right. It transforms Robin from a desperate fugitive into a romantic icon, his defiance stitched into every vibrant thread. The legend needed a color bold enough to match his spirit, even if history suggests he dressed more like a man who knew how to disappear. The image of Robin Hood tossing bags of gold to grateful peasants makes for stirring ballads, but how much did medieval outlaws actually redistribute wealth? The truth lies buried in the complex web of feudal obligations and church doctrine that shaped charity in the Middle Ages. On the surface, England's poor relief laws seemed generous. Monasteries were required to set aside 1/10 of their income for alms, and nobles were expected to practice largesse as a virtue. Yet dig deeper and you'll find a system riddled with hypocrisy. Many abbeys hoarded grain during famines, selling it at inflated prices rather than distributing it as charity. Lords touted their generosity while enforcing brutal enclosure laws that pushed families off common lands. In this world, Robin's legendary raids on abbots and sheriffs weren't just fantasy. They were poetic justice for audiences who'd watched the powerful weaponize benevolence. Court records reveal a darker side to outlaw charity. Real medieval bandits like the infamous Cottrell Gang operated more like protection rackets than woodland philanthropists extorting villagers for safety fees rather than sharing spoils. Yet ballads transformed these harsh realities into moral fables. When a jest of Robin Hood shows Robin lending money to an indebted knight, it's mirroring a genuine crisis. By the 1400s, countless small landowners were being bankrupted by predatory loans from monasteries. The ballad's wish fulfillment lies in watching the church's own gold turned against it. This wasn't pure fiction. Cases like Roger Godber's gang show outlaws sometimes spared peasants while targeting tax collectors, earning them grassroots support. The legend's brilliance was in twisting feudal obligations. Medieval law mandated that travelers could demand hospitality from any manor, a system often abused by corrupt officials. Robin Hood ballads flipped this script, showing the outlaw commanding meals from abbots before redistributing their wealth. It's satire with teeth. What if the poor could enforce the generosity the rich only pretended to practice? Even Robin's famous deer poaching carried layered meaning. Forest laws reserved game for the king, leaving peasants to starve while royal hunts wasted meat. By stealing a deer, Robin wasn't just breaking the law, he was exposing its cruelty, but the sharpest contrast lies in the audience's hunger for the tales. Medieval peasants couldn't vote or revolt without facing execution, but they could cheer ballads where the sheriff was humiliated and the abbot's purse emptied. Each performance was a fleeting reversal of power, a chance to imagine justice served by an arrow's point. The real giving to the poor may not have been bags of gold, it was the gift of seeing greed punished, if only in song. And that, perhaps, was worth more than any stolen coin. Robin Hood isn't England's exclusive export. Every culture, it seems, has its own version of the noble outlaw, a shadowy figure who steals from the powerful and becomes a folk hero in the process. Take Japan's Ishikawa Goemon, a bandit who prowled the 16th century like a phantom. Legends say he raided warlords' castles, tossing gold to peasants from the rooftops before vanishing into the night. Sound familiar, but Goemon's story took a grisly turn when he was caught and boiled alive in a public execution meant to terrify would-be rebels. Yet instead of fading into infamy, he became a folk icon, his defiance immortalized in kabuki plays where he's often depicted as a cheeky antihero, midair in a daring escape. The parallels to Robin are uncanny. Both men walk the line between criminal and crusader, their legends growing larger in death precisely because their executions exposed the brutality of the systems they defied. Then there's Germany's Skinderhans, the robber of the Hunsrück, who terrorized the Rhineland in the late 1700s. Unlike Robin's medieval bow, Skinderhans wielded a flintlock pistol, but his tactics were straight out of Sherwood, robbing tax collectors, evading capture with local support, and even distributing spoils to the poor. His trial transcripts reveal a man acutely aware of his own myth. He defended himself with charm, casting his crimes as rebellions against French occupiers during the Napoleonic Wars. When he was finally guillotined in 1803, 20,000 spectators showed up, not to jeer but to mourn. Like Robin, his story was a mirror held up to oppression, proving that outlaw heroes thrive where injustice runs deep. But here's the twist: these figures aren't just carbon copies. Goemon's legend is steeped in Buddhist themes of karma and sacrifice, while Skinderhan's exploits reflected post-revolutionary Europe's turbulent class wars. What unites them is something deeper than stolen gold. It's the way they expose the fractures in their societies. In feudal Japan, where warlords ruled with absolute power, Goemon's audacity was a fantasy of resistance. In occupied Germany, Skinderhans became a symbol of regional pride against foreign rule. And in medieval England, where sheriffs and abbots squeezed the poor dry, Robin Hood gave voice to the voiceless. Even the methods differ. Robin's archery contests and woodland ambushes reflect England's yeoman culture, where skill with a bow was a source of pride. Goemon, by contrast, was a master of ninjutsu, using stealth and misdirection tools of the marginalized in a society that valued honor-bound samurai. Skinderhans, operating in the age of early capitalism, targeted merchants and taxmen, echoing growing resentment toward economic exploitation. Yet all three share a core DNA. They're underdogs who weaponize wit against overwhelming force, their stories told and retold because they let ordinary people imagine winning, if only for a moment. Perhaps the most telling similarity is how these legends evolve. Just as Robin Hood gained a crusader backstory to suit Tudor sensibilities, Goman was later recast as a defender of Kyoto's commoners, while Skinderhand's nationalism was amplified in 20th century retellings. Their stories bend to fit the anxieties of each era, proving that the outlaw hero isn't just a character, he's a pressure valve for collective frustration. From Korean Hong Gildong to Brazilian Lampião, these figures arise wherever power is concentrated and justice feels out of reach. They remind us that the urge to root for the bandit isn't about lawlessness, it's about the desperate hope that somewhere, someone is fighting back. Archaeologists sifting through Sherwood Forest soil have uncovered more than just arrowheads. They've found whispers of rebellion buried in the dirt. Recent digs near the crumbling remains of medieval hunting lodges reveal something unexpected. Hidden compartments beneath floorboards, perfect for stashing stolen goods or hiding from the sheriff's men. One lodge, just a stone's throw from the famed Major Oak, yielded a trove of silver coins minted during King John's reign, the same era when Robin Hood's legend first took root. The coins weren't neatly stored in a chest but scattered as if dropped in haste. Was this the spoils of an ambush or evidence of a frantic escape? Then there's the mystery of the outlaw's hearth, a small fire pit discovered deep in a secluded thicket far from any known village. Carbon dating places it squarely in the 1300s, and the surrounding soil told a tantalizing tale, fragments of deer bones, butchered with skill, alongside shards of expensive French pottery. This wasn't some starving peasant's camp. Someone here dined like nobility while living like a fugitive. Could it have been a hideout for Robin's mythical band, or perhaps a real outlaw borrowing his tactics? The pottery suggests a connection to the clergy, raising the ghostly possibility of a corrupt abbot's stolen finery repurposed by forest rebels. Even more compelling is the discovery of a concealed ford across the River Lee, its banks littered with horseshoes and broken wagon wheels. This wasn't on any medieval map, yet where patterns show it was heavily used, historians speculated could have been an outlaw's secret crossing, bypassing the sheriff's toll bridges. The clincher, a rusted dagger found wedged in the riverbank, its hilt marked with a crude R, maybe a maker's mark or maybe something more, but the real treasure lies in what hasn't been found yet. Ground-penetrating radar recently flagged anomalies near Clipstone, site of King John's royal hunting palace. Some whisper it could be the long-lost Outlaw's Cave from ballads, where Robin supposedly hid a fortune. Others caution it might just be a collapsed cellar. Either way, the hunt is on. With every shovel of earth turned, Sherwood yields fragments of a world where history and legend blur, where a scattered coin or a hidden path might just rewrite the story of England's most famous outlaw. The forest isn't done giving up its secrets, and neither, it seems, is Robin Hood. Robin Hood's story lingers in that hazy realm where history and myth twine together like ivy around an ancient oak. For every scrap of parchment that hints at a real outlaw, some desperate yeoman or disgraced noble, there's another layer of balladry, another century of embellishment, until the man vanishes behind the legend. That's the magic of it. Robin Hood isn't just a medieval bandit or a folktale. He's a mirror reflecting back whatever we need him to be, a rebel, a rogue, a righteous thief. So was he real? The answer might not matter as much as the question itself. Walk through Nottingham's archives and you'll find enough tantalizing fragments to keep the debate alive. A faded court roll here, a smuggler's dagger there, a village tale passed down through generations. Or swing by Sherwood Forest and press your hand against the gnarled bark of the Major Oak, its hollow trunk big enough to hide a dozen outlaws. History doesn't always give us neat answers, but it leaves breadcrumbs for the curious. That's where you come in. Dive into the comments and weigh the evidence. Was Robin Hood a lone archer, a collective fantasy, or something in between? Could he have been a dozen men, their deeds braided into one unforgettable name? The truth might be buried in the soil of Barnsdale, hidden in a forgotten ballad, or waiting in some dusty ledger yet to be scanned. But here's the thing, whether he ever drew breath or not, his legacy is real enough. 800 years later, we're still spinning stories about him, still dressing up in green for festivals, still whispering his name when the powerful grow too greedy. Maybe that's the real robbery. He stole immortality right from under history's nose. So as we lower the hood on this tale, let's borrow his own words, the ones that echo across the centuries, sharp as an arrow's flight. Rob from the rich, give to the poor. Simple, bold, and just rebellious enough to make you grin. Until next time, keep your quiver full and your aim true. The legend isn't done with us yet.